I'm going to um, now give you a talk, about movement. And of course, if I say movement, movement is about life. Everything is movement, really. From the first twitch in the womb, of our mother's womb, to the last dying flicker of the nervous system. Our lives are constantly movement, involved in movement, in all its diverse aspects. Sensation, just think of that. Thought, action, or emotion. Movement is life. Most often, we focus on our actions, but very rarely we notice how we move. And our attention is drawn to our patterns and habits of movements only when we have pain or dysfunction, or when we wish to learn a new skill or to perform at an elite level. There are principles, of course, and when we talk about principles, we have to understand that principles are power, and there is power in principles. A long, long time ago, humans discovered that a key to understanding complex ideas was to search for underlying similarities, sort of patterns that connect and principles that explain. Some principles or laws are so foundational, so fundamental, that we begin teaching them as children's tales, fables. We are told how Archimedes discovered the principle of buoyancy by stepping into a bathtub, famously solving the question of a fraudulent gold crown. And we also knew how Newton, when he was hit by a falling apple, discovered the law of gravity, thus explaining the moon's rotation around the earth. A good principle helps us discover that aha moment by erasing sort of those boundaries that exist in our thinking, but not in the natural world. When we do this, interesting connections appear, giving us new solutions. And if these principles are strong, if they are robust, they will hold true across cultures, across race, and even across species. It will be possible for us to apply them in a range of contexts, including therapy, performance, martial arts, even self-development, and working with animals. You'll be able to actively test them in your field of interest as you develop in life. In regular conversation, movement usually refers to something we can see, a physical shift in shape or position, whether it is as subtle as a twitch of the eyelid or as gross as a leap through space. We commonly put them in categories. We put movement as a category, for example, as physical activity. We think of thinking as a mental activity, and sensing and feeling as emotional activities. But what I'm going to tell you and suggest really is that movement is an integration of thinking, sensing, and feeling with action in such a way that a change in one will change the whole. And the components may be distinct, but they are not separable in a functioning human being. The idea of sensing means that it belongs to information from the receptors of our nervous system. The receptors bring us information from both our external and internal environments. We can sense temperature, pressure, light, color, vibrations, position, and so many other things. When we describe sensory experience, we will use words that describe texture, weight, volume, maybe intervals or intensity. And even though it's common for us to say we feel these distinctions, these are our sensations, but not our feelings. Feelings are construction. They're built from sensation. What does that mean? This means that internal sensory information from our interoceptors is where we get our sensing information. It's common for us to distinguish between feelings that we think of as physiological, we're tired, we're hungry, or being jittery, versus emotional. We're happy, we're disgusted, we're in love. But in the context of movement, we're using feelings to represent both. Sensing gives us very important information on our internal and external environment. We can usually find objective consensus for sensory information. That means we can agree. We can agree on what is lighter or heavier, less or more salty, things like that. But feelings are more subjective. They're less available to consensus, but not less important. Our internal sensation is corralled into the primary division of feelings, pleasant, unpleasant, so fast, so swiftly that it is almost impossible for our cognitive processes to even notice. Our cognitive processes means our thinking to really even notice when a feeling starts or at the beginning of any or every emotion we experience. Now, both sensing and feeling are enormously important to how we experience and move in the world. Human movements, or those of any animal, let's say, are shaped as much as by external environment, our external environment, as by all our internal factors. Our culture, our society, our environments, social, cultural, and physical environments are inseparable one from another when we think of how we develop and how we move through the earth. And they always need to be considered when improving, when changing, or developing movement. I think you would agree with me that stories are very powerful. When you have to learn something and there's a story involved, you'll remember that story quite easily. Why does that happen? Well, because stories bridge theory and practice. From parables, things that we hear generally in religious or spiritual contexts or readings, to case studies or research that leads to case studies. These are all stories that help us clarify meaning. It stimulates our memory and provide clues for us to use. And what usually starts as a grand statement or an abstract concept can expand into an actionable idea through the power of stories. Stories are made up sometimes, they are traditional, they have been learned in cultures, and we know them from when we were young, but also when we have grown. But this is one story that is made up, and it's adapted from an old parable to illustrate some themes of this notion of movement. And the parable involves perspectives. It's a powerful story, and a story of perspectives, a parable of perspectives. Moving, as we mentioned, moving with ease and mastery is one of the great pleasures of life. Yet, from a very young age, we encounter rules, we have constraints and dogmas that limit our choices. But once we have internalized rules and dogmas, it is difficult to recognize them and how they work. And every now and then we need to play. We need to play with new perspectives, which is where this story of the blind man and the elephant comes in. Here it goes. Once upon a time, an elephant appeared in a village. Elephants were unknown in the region, and the citizens were mystified. They couldn't believe their ears. So they sent for the village elders, and they were 7 blind men. And they needed to be sent for because they had to explain this new phenomenon, this elephant. When they went to see the elephant, each one laid his hands on a different part of the elephant, trying to investigate his area in detail when beginning to speak. The blind man standing at the side of the elephant found the beast was rather like a wall. The one at the ear of the elephant felt the wall, but found the delicate flapping lobe of greater importance, and his opinion was that the beast was rather like a fan. The blind man who explored the trunk explained that the beast was rather like a snake, because the tail and the leg and the tusk, each of the elders that had a particular part of the elephant in their hands chose always something familiar to explain the beast. The 7th blind man, who was a little more adventurous than his colleagues, shimmied up the tree that shaded the elephant, and slowly he inched out over an overhanging branch, hoping the creature might now be under him. To his delight, it was, So he gently eased himself onto the broad back of the elephant. Meanwhile, at ground level, things were getting heated. Each wise man spoke with eloquence and vehemence, wanting to convince the others of his own perspective. And as often happens when opinions are different, a fight broke out. That was enough for the elephant, and off it went down the road with the adventurous blind man scrambling to stay seated on its shoulders, while the villagers scattered in fear. Ah, what a privileged seat! What a privileged seat that seventh elder had. The seventh blind man could feel the whole elephant galvanize into action. He could sense skin, muscle, and bone, and oh so much more. The great head led the forward direction as the shoulders and spine tilted and turned beneath him. The legs moved in a rhythm, contrapuntal to the breathtaking ribs. They were moving in harmony. He could sense through subtle changes that just as his own fright was diminishing, so too was the elephant's fright diminishing. Gradually, man and beast settled into a pleasurable rhythmic partnership, and this is where he found his own description, not just for the elephant, but for the uniting of elephant and man in movement. We, thought the blind man, are rather like a dance. When the seventh blind man was rescued safely from the back of the creature, he stood motionless on the ground for a few moments, noticing that after the adventure he felt very, very different. His curiosity had placed him in a unique position. The 6 older elders had worked with their hands and their heads as they usually did, and found one strong and static perspective each, as they usually did. His, the 7th elder, was the new experience where those habits were no longer helpful. He was thrust into a large arena of awareness than he had ever used before, where he needed to think, to move, to sense, and feel differently. This was both a bigger and a simpler way of knowing the world than he had ever imagined, and he dedicated the rest of his life to it. Now, from this parable to wonder, to our sense of wonder, is what I want to talk to you about now. The powerful parable of the 6 blind men and the elephant has a very long history. It first appeared more than 2 millennia ago and has been told many times since. Obviously, humans have always needed a reminder of our tendency to fixate on single perspectives when many more are available and important. We've added a 7th man to the story, also blind, also taking only one position on the elephant from which he could form his opinion. And from that position on the beast's back, he was able to experience the elephant using more of his body and all his senses, inside and out. He was able to feel the skin, the flesh, and bone, and he was able to also feel rhythm and response, not just in the animal, but in himself as well. The 7th man's dedication is ours too. We are dedicated, I am dedicated to the wonder of knowing ourselves, how to know other people and the world around us in the most direct way possible through movement. Now, in order for us to do that and to learn that, I'm going to summarize what I mean into 7 principles, 7 organizing principles of movement, because in the future we're going to talk about movement a lot. Now, why do I want us to talk about organizing principles? Well, because organization and the way we organize things is very important, and in movement, the organization is not imposed, but it comes from our nervous systems and it brings us to organize incoming and outgoing signals. So let's start with the principles, and I'll make you understand through examples. Principle number 1, organizing principle number 1. Balance is dynamic. Remember that all movement requires a delicate balance, a dynamic balance between stability and instability. Principle number 2. Skeleton alignment liberates movement. When your skeleton is aligned for support, the large muscles are freed for action and movement becomes light and powerful. Principle number 3. Progress to being upright is cyclical. What do I mean by that? Evolving to stand upright with a 360-degree view of the world is a sequential progression that is revisited with each major movement challenge. Therefore, it is cyclical. Principle number 4, qualities refine self-direction. Here, attention to quality of movement creates a system, an internal reference system, our own internal reference system for exploring movement, recognizing unconscious habits, and learning new ways to move. Very important, the next principle, number 5. Our head guides and the pelvis drives. Our head guides and the pelvis drives. Efficient movement requires a head that is free to move and free to orient us, connected by an adaptable spine to the power generated at the pelvis. Pelvic power, therefore. And principle number 6, power is central, and meaning central literally, it is central, and precision is peripheral, on the periphery. Strength and force come from the center, while direction and accuracy come from the extremities. Remember, all this is in relation to movement. And our last principle, number 7, is that pressure organizes. What I mean by this is the demands of internal or external pressure create and test our ability to respond with well-organized movement. Now, this is one of my favorite topics coming up. the presence of absence in relation to movement. The principles I just mentioned are a way to recognize both the patterns and potentials in our movement. Stimulating or restoring an absent potential has immense therapeutic value and will often be where the principles are most usefully applied. Yet, noticing absence, knowing what we don't know, or seeing what is missing is not as easy as we think. It is easier said than done. There are two aspects to consider regarding absence. First, we are quicker to notice the presence of struggle, of pain, or discomfort than its absence. When you are experiencing difficulties and then they disappear, you might think it would be immediately obvious. But more commonly, it can be days, weeks, or months before remembering, oh, I used to get a pain when I did this. I wonder when that changed. By the time we notice the absence, we cannot remember exactly what made the difference. So we do not build on our best strategies for change. Because grace, ease, and pleasure occur in the absence of struggle, pain, and discomfort, if we regularly search for these three delights, ease, grace, and pleasure, it helps us to notice change and our role in change, and it helps us to notice it more efficiently. And the second aspect is an absence in our image of movement. We need an idea that something is possible or even exists before we search for it. For example, most things you can do with your fingers, you can also do with your toes. You can interlace them, you can cross them, you can type with them, even if with a bit more difficulty. But few of us have ever explored this potential because we never thought about it, and we never thought to do that. The idea was absent in our image of toe movements. We all have these absences or blind spots. Some are common, some are unique, but each hides a piece of our potential. They're hard to see in ourselves or to illuminate in others. It's hard to identify them, but to identify them, we must both recognize that they could exist, therefore imagining them, the idea of it. And then we have to observe from different angles, from multiple angles, in case they do exist. I hear talked about concepts, talked about stories, images, and recommended some kind of brief experiments, all to help you get an idea of what we're missing. I believe that you can shift your perspective and bring curiosity into the idea of movement before judging yourself. This will also help you identify absence and opportunity. With the right attitude, discovering absences becomes an exciting arrow to imminent